Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Zachariah Renfro. I'm so excited to have you with me here today. Today we're going to talk about Plato's Apology. We're going to talk about some of the history surrounding it. We're going to talk about the text itself. And we're going to talk about Socrates as a character. As I've mentioned in previous videos, we got an image here from Existential Comics. I recommend you check them out if you're interested in philosophy. It's a series of web comics that parody and highlight the lives of different philosophers throughout history, and I think it definitely makes the study of philosophy more interesting. I think it's a valuable contribution to the field. So, as we get into Plato's Apology, this is the start of what many consider to be Western philosophy. This is where philosophy as a discipline breaks off from sophism and rhetoric to become something different. This is the founding incident in Western philosophy. Socrates basically sacrifices his life for the love of philosophy. And this is something that has been seen to be significant by generations of readers all the way from the time of Socrates. This brings up many important questions about how we should live, what we should do, and what we should be willing to die for. Socrates himself was willing to die for his philosophical pursuits. When we're younger, many of us would find that to be a worthy and noble goal, but as we get older, our views tend to change. So we'll kind of keep that in mind as well. Keep in mind how a younger person reading this might have a different view than an older person. This right here is a brief overview of what we're going to cover. We'll go through the history of Athens and the history of the major events in Socrates' life. We will talk about Aristophanes' Clouds, which is a pretty libelous play that paints Socrates in a pretty harsh light, but we will discuss it. We'll talk about the charges against Socrates. We'll talk about Xenophon's version of the apology. We'll talk about Aeschines, who was a rhetorician, in his argument against Timarchus, where he makes reference to the trial of Socrates. I do think this provides some interesting additional background. We'll talk about Xenophon's Memorabilia. We'll actually then finally get into Plato's Apology. We'll get into Socrates' defense, or at least as Plato recounts it. And then we'll talk about Socrates and the social contract. As we are getting into these things, we want to keep in mind that Socrates does have a lot to say about the social contract, and he's one of the first people to talk about it. He had the option to, at several points, to flee Athens to avoid being tried and to avoid facing death, but he felt that it was his duty as a citizen to face those things. He lived and benefited under the laws of ancient Athens and felt that as a citizen he must face the consequences, whatever those might be. So starting with the birth of Socrates, Socrates was born sometime around 469, and his father was a stonecutter. This is very important when we think about Socrates, because he's not coming from a lot of wealth and power, but we see by the end of his life, he ends up in a position of power at one point and is associates or friends with many people who are in power. Socrates comes of age and grows to be an adult during the reign of Pericles. Pericles was one of the people who strengthened Athenian democracy. He put together a lot of big work projects, and he also was part of the first Peloponnesian War. You know, that's the first war against Sparta and the other states. And it lasted about 15 years. So this is a kind of foundational event in Socrates' life, because we see later on in the works of Plato, Plato being Socrates' student, that he also reflects positively on the rule of Pericles. Pericles was quite the hero in ancient Athens, so it's not hard to see that Socrates, growing up in the age of Pericles, probably held a lot of reverence for him and probably imparted that to his students. In 447, this is something where there's a little bit of debate about. There's a bit of debate over whether or not Socrates served at Coronia. I think odds are he did, because he would have been right around the perfect age to be serving in that battle, but you know, the evidence is not 100% certain. We see several more periods of military service. As a citizen, he did have a duty to serve in the military. We see at 432 Potidea, then we see Delium, and then we see Amphipolis. And what's interesting about these is he meets a guy and he works alongside a guy named Alcibiades. Alcibiades will later go on to become a general. Socrates saves his life at one point, and they seem to have a great amount of friendship between each other. This is important because Alcibiades will defect to the Spartan side of the war around 415. So he will go from being loyal to Athens to loyal to Sparta. And part of this defection is that he had been prosecuted in absentia and tried for, convicted for desecration of the Temple of Hermes. So we're going to see these kind of religious based charges pop up again with Socrates later. But it's important for us to keep in mind that the people of Athens, at least some number of them, did take their religion to be somewhat seriously. There are people that say, oh, well, they didn't really take it seriously. No one could take these talk of the gods and Zeus all that seriously. But, we have Alcibiades being tried for desecration of the temple. So whether they were taking the stories of the gods to be literal truth or as more figurative or, whatever metaphysical form they envisioned the gods as being. And this is something, again, that is probably something that gets Socrates into trouble. It is worthwhile to note that they do find them important. Now, between 424 and 422, we see Socrates serving at two different points, and we see Aristophanes writing a play about Socrates. So let's dive into this a little bit. So around 424, Socrates is going to be in his mid 40s, and same for 422 when he's serving at Amphipolis. Odds are, during these two stints of service, he's probably not a frontline foot soldier. He's probably made it up to be the equivalent of a modern military team lead, maybe a sergeant or a lieutenant or something like that. But he's probably not at the very bottom of the totem pole because he's older. He's served honorably at other battles. He's gotten a reputation for himself. And the way that we know that he has a reputation for himself is because Aristophanes writes a libelous play about him. Now, keep in mind, depending on where you read, ancient Athens had somewhere between 40 and 140,000 people living there, depending on the specific source you read. Socrates is just one of these people, and Socrates has a libelous play written about him. So it is, I don't think, hard to imagine that Socrates, during his military service, would be at a higher position than just a foot soldier. That, combined with his honorable service at Potidea and the fact that he becomes friends with Alcibiades, who's, a general, it is not hard to imagine that he's in a position of military leadership. Aristophanes and his play do make a lot of claims about Socrates, which we will discuss in more detail. But it goes to show that while Socrates and Plato and Xenophon paint him as a meek, humble character who has no larger ambitions, I think that it is historically evident that there was at least some stuff going on that perhaps has not been written about. And let me say it more specifically like this. A person could be, relatively poor and could be living in rather humble circumstances and still be politically powerful to some extent. And what do I mean by that? Well, look at, for example, Gandhi. And I'm not saying that Socrates is the same as Gandhi, but if you met Gandhi on the street, he is someone who is living in pretty abject poverty. He is someone who does not have a bunch of material wealth. He doesn't have, a high elected position, but yet he was revered by millions of people, and his words and actions influenced others so that they would act certain ways. And it could be very well the case that Socrates was something similar to that. The specific dimensions of that is hard to define. We don't have the strong evidence either way, but it is something to keep in mind. Around 411, democracy is overthrown. We get the oligarchs ruling. After that, Socrates is elected by lot to serve on the ruling council of Athens. And this is important. This is very important because this council wants to put to death a bunch of Athenian generals, and Socrates argues against it. And although it's stated that the elections were held by lot and it was random, anyone who keeps an eye on, say, modern day politics knows that there was probably some backroom dealing going on. There was something going on with this. It just seems a bit too convenient to me that Socrates is the one who magically, out of, say, 40,000 people, magically gets drawn up to serve on this council, right? There had to have been some more to it. Now, it might have been the case that perhaps the lot was only a handful of people, and Socrates was one of that handful. But I do think it is relevant. So in 404, Athens is defeated by Sparta. The rule of 30 is instituted, and Critias is basically a tyrant king. He's been called the first Robespierre. He has executed something like 1,000 people, about 5,000 more exiled. And, he was a bad guy. There was a lot of ill will towards Critias. Keep in mind, Critias is a former student of Socrates, Alcibiades, former friend and student of Socrates, right? So you got these two people here who were Socrates' pupils at one point, and they've done these bad things that have really caused a lot of issue with Athenian society. In addition, Socrates and Plato both show quite a bit of reverence for Sparta. There is reference by other writers that Socrates' students are somewhat Socratified, Spartanified, and during this whole time, the time of the oligarchs and the rule of Critias, Socrates is still going around questioning people, still going around causing issues with people in power, right? Because we see from all this that Socrates has found himself in a position close to the people of power. He's not some nobody living on the street. He is in connection with the people of power. And in the ancient world, and even in medieval times, when you get close to the seat of power, there's danger, right? The PBS masterpieces show Wolf Hall, which follows Thomas Cromwell. And I'm not saying Socrates is like Cromwell, right? But as he gets closer and closer to the seat of power, Cromwell is put in more and more dangerous, put in more and more danger. And we see the same with Socrates. As he gets towards the top of the lot, as he gets into more and more power, closer to these people in power, the more danger he's going to come against, right? So 20 years before his trial, he had a libelous play. He's been on a ruling council of Athens. 2 of his students have committed crimes against the state of Athens, right? So we need to keep this background in mind. 403, Critias is out, democracy is restored, and a general pardon is given to anyone in relation to the rule of the 30 and the 400 oligarchs. So everyone gets a pardon, including Socrates, which brings us to the next part. The people of Athens probably want blood. They are probably upset that their family members have been killed. And similar to how there were the Nuremberg trials after World War II, they're probably looking for ways to put people they believe to be held accountable to account. Socrates is one of them, but he's received a general pardon. So they're going to, I believe, start looking for other ways to get rid of Socrates. Next, we move on to Aristophanes' Clouds. It's a comedic tale about Socrates, who runs a thinkery. It's a school. He's a bumbling philosopher who talks nonsense and teaches all his students nonsense. It takes place during the Second Peloponnesian War, and this is really important to keep in mind. Aristophanes is writing this libelous play about Socrates During the time of the Second Peloponnesian War, 20 years before his trial, I think it's very well the case that if Socrates did not have a formal school, that it was probably the case that he was at least having people over to his house and expounding and philosophizing on various topics. And we see that within the clouds as well. So this is one thing we want to keep in mind about ancient philosophy. Ancient philosophy was not just pontificating from first principles and using reason to find things. There was also some amount of experimentation and analysis, right? So when the main character arrives at the thinkery and first sees the students, they're all down looking at the ground, examining for causes of the dirt, which is kind of interesting, but today we would view that as like a natural science, right? Socrates, in the sense, is not just teaching natural science, but he's also teaching metaphysics. He's teaching ethics. It's a whole picture. Now we'll hear Socrates say at his trial that he never willingly taught anyone, and that if anyone learned anything from him, it was purely accidental, just because the young men liked to follow him around. Now, that could be true, but it could also be the case that perhaps there's more to the story that's not being said. I'm not saying Socrates is a liar, but I'm saying there are a lot of ways that you could stretch the truth around that statement in order to make it seem as though it's something it's not. And that's something that I think Socrates, as a speaker and rhetorician, would be very skilled at doing. In the play, Socrates is shown as being a sophist, and that he argues for any case, whether it's right or wrong. He's going to make the worse argument better and the better argument worse. And in this play, we see that he's come up with this new divinity he calls the Clouds. This is a group of human women who go around and sing inspiration to the heads of these philosophers. They're a new divinity, right? Well, we'll see this charge come up again during his trial. We've got Socrates already 20 years before being accused of creating a new divinity. And in the play, Socrates says, well, these divines, these clouds, are the best thing we've got because all the other gods are just nonsense. Now that seems pretty tough right there. And that seems like it is a direct attack on Athenian religion. I'm not saying that Socrates was some sort of atheist, and I'm not saying that Socrates didn't believe in Athenian religion, but I am saying for it to have made it into this play, there's probably a chance that at least once, at least one time, Socrates made arguments about the nature of the divines. And we see from Plato's work on the forms, we see this in the Republic, and we see this in the Parmenides, and all this, that you've got this realm of perfect forms, perfect simple forms. Beneath that, you have the realm of geometries, which is combined forms. Beneath that, you have the real material world, and beneath that, you have the world of images, which is things that we create in the real world. Now, you can give the perfect forms, you can give them divine names. You can call them Zeus, you can call them Hermes, you can call them whatever, but you could also call them other things. So while it could be that Socrates was metaphysically pontificating that the Greek gods were also perfect forms, it could also be the case that he was talking about something different, and perhaps the audience misunderstood that. Perhaps the audience didn't quite follow what he was saying, but it is something to keep in mind. Now, it is also worth noting in the play that Socrates is shown as being a sophist. Now, we see in Plato's work that there's this real hard distinction drawn between a sophist and a philosopher, but it's not entirely clear if the general population understands that distinction, right? In English, philosopher, is lover of wisdom, whereas a sophist is basically just like a wise guy, right? Professional wise guy. In the play, it talks about how Socrates trains people to argue in front of a jury, how to argue a trial. But you can't really teach something if you've never done it yourself. And this leads me to my second part. Socrates says he never charged for his teaching, which, I can believe that. I can I can take that argument at face value that he never charged one single drachma for his teaching. But it could be the case that he did charge for legal services, that he did charge to help people prepare for trials, or that he did charge to speak for people at trials. Because it wouldn't be a lie to say that you didn't charge for teaching, but that you did help people with trials. And well, what happens if you're helping people with trials? You're getting to see people in power. They're seeing you in a position of authority. So it would make sense to me that Socrates was being seen frequently on the public stage, so to speak, and that's part of the reason why he gets this reputation. This is part of the reason why he gets the clouds written about him. Think about it. Even at its smallest estimated size of 40,000 people, not every one of those people is getting a play written about them. Only Socrates, right? So that is something we want to keep in mind. In the play, Socrates is shown to insult Greek religion. His students are starved, and sometimes he occasionally beats them. They're getting bitten by fleas. And he's also shown to extort donations from his students, right? And that's another thing. So, and I think this is kind of interesting because Socrates says he doesn't charge a single drachma or a single minute to his students to teach them. Okay. But in the play, we see him basically extorting the main character to get his cloak, to get the cloak from him. So it could be the case that Socrates, yes, did not charge any money, but if you wanted to learn from him, he might say, oh, well, bring us some food to eat. Or, I need a new cloak. Can you bring me a cloak? Or some other thing, such that it's not necessarily a payment of cash, but it is a barter. So again, there are lots of ways that we can take Socrates' statement and see that he could still be telling the truth, but the truth means something different. The main character's son studies under Socrates after the main character tries to study under him. And when the son comes out, he starts beating the father, chasing him through the streets, and eventually disgruntled students burn the school down. Now, I want you to think about this. One of the charges against Socrates is corrupting the youth. And here, 20 years before his trial, we see an argument being made that Socrates is corrupting the youth. Let's go back to our timeline. Let's look at this real close. So the play is written in 423. Alcibiades defects in 415. Critias, all that happens in 404. So this play predates Alcibiades, it predates Critias, but yet we're still seeing this charge of corrupting the youth. So it is very likely that there was something going on, that there was at least one student of Socrates who come away from Socrates' learning with a nasty view towards their parents. So I grabbed the charges against Socrates, and Socrates does bring them up in Plato's version of the Apology. And remember, apology means defense. It's a legal defense. But I wanted to pull them from Xenophon, right? Because what we're looking for is we're looking for multiple sources saying approximately the same thing to kind of confirm anything, right? So we see something similar in Plato's version. I'm looking at Xenophon's version. Socrates was charged with not believing in the gods and introduction to new deities. Well, we see that from the clouds, don't we? We see a very similar story being written 20 years before. Then additionally, he was charged with corruption of the young, corrupting the youth, however you want to say it. He was charged with corruption of the young. So these are pretty serious charges. Athens is a patriarchal society. It is a democracy, but it is a patriarchal society. And filial piety, or, honor towards your parents, is seen as a key virtue. If it is the case that Socrates is corrupting the young, then he's throwing the whole social order out of balance. And then when we look at worship of the gods, you got to keep in mind, this is a pre-science society. This is a society where they have to make the best guesses that they can about what's happening in the world. There is probably a very large portion of the population who believes that if someone is not faithful to the gods, and if they don't practice the right things, that they will be punished by the gods, from tyrants being put into power, or earthquakes, or tornadoes, or droughts, or whatever, right? So we want to keep this in mind. If it is the case that Socrates is introducing new deities and he's not respecting the gods of Athens, then he could be putting the whole city in danger. So we have to keep that in mind. We're going to look at Xenophon's version of the Apology before we look at Plato's, because again, we're looking for compare and contrast. We're looking for similarity between the two. Xenophon reports Socrates is old. He's about 70, but he knows that his health is getting worse, and he didn't want to suffer through disease or gradual body failure as he aged and died. It's said that Socrates argued very valiantly against charges of impiety. However, his arguments of corrupting the youth weren't as convincing. In Xenophon's version, he basically says that he's a teacher of wisdom and he's a teacher of human goodness. And in some cases, he is better at teaching those things than the parents. In the same way a parent would take their child to a doctor if the doctor was sick and listen to the doctor's opinion, they should let the child go to Socrates to listen to Socrates' opinion, which isn't necessarily a convincing argument against the charge of corrupting the youth, because the charge of corrupting the youth isn't that Socrates can't teach certain things. It's that Socrates' teachings have a bad effect on the youth, that they have a negative outcome. Xenophon, and this is something else I want to mention, a slight difference between Xenophon's version and Plato's version. Xenophon reports Socrates had a bunch of people who spoke on his behalf. Plato leaves that out. I do think Xenophon's version is probably closer to reality. I do think it's the case that Socrates did have quite a few witnesses, and I do think it's the case that the prosecution, Miletus and Anytus, had a lot of witnesses as well. There's also reports, I believe that Xenophon makes this report, that at one point Plato, who was about 19 or 20 at the time, tried to stand up and speak and was booed off stage. With that being said, if something of that nature were true, then it might be the case that Plato didn't want to include the witnesses in his version because it would have made him look bad, right? So we need to keep that in mind. I do think there were other witnesses who spoke for and against Socrates, and we see from the final result that whatever they said didn't necessarily work. In Aeschines, in his work Against Timarchus, it's an argument against a guy named Timarchus. Aeschines is a rhetorician or a sophist, however you want to say it, and he's presenting an argument to a jury, and presumably a lot of these members of the jury are the same as the ones who tried Socrates. And he presents this argument. Did you put to death Socrates the sophist? Keep in mind there's that word sophist, because he was shown to have been the teacher of Critias, one of the 30 who put down democracy. So let's think about that for a second. He's got these charges of impiety. He's got these charges of corrupting the youth. And here after his death, we see someone else talking about how he was put to death because of Critias, because of his former student. So think about that for a second. I believe that a lot of this trial was somewhat politically motivated. I believe that it was also motivated out of fear that if Socrates is impious and if he is corrupting the youth, then we're going to see more Critiases rising to power who are going to threaten democracy, right? Because Socrates, as shown at least by Plato, is not the biggest lover of democracy. He believes it basically becomes a form of mob rule, and perhaps it does. But we see here that when it comes to Socrates, again, much like with Aristophanes, the general public doesn't seem to quite know the difference between a sophist and a philosopher, assuming there even is a difference, one. And then two, discussion of Critias and Alcibiades must have been a very important part of this trial. It must have been a key point that was discussed in detail. Additionally, Xenophon's Memorabilia, which is written after after the trial, after Socrates is already put to death, it spends more time examining the evidence. He argues Socrates was frequently at temples and took part in religious worship, and he argues that Alcibiades and Critias only turned bad because they stopped following Socrates. He argued that Socrates promoted frugalness, avoidance of greed, and self control. And even these things that he presents about Socrates, we can see that they might be a little bit shocking to the Athenian mind. In Athens, if you were seen as being wealthy, you must have gotten your wealth because the gods smiled upon you and you were closer to human perfection. If you kept your body in good health and, exercised to be physically good and done all these good things, you know, you were seen as being closer to the model of human perfection. So to have someone arguing against that, well, that's kind of shocking to the Athenian conscience. And his view that Alcibiades and Critias only turned back because they left Socrates, well, that doesn't present a very good picture for Socrates at all, because it's basically like saying Socrates is breeding these attack dogs, and if they ever get away from him, someone's going to get hurt, which isn't necessarily as strong an argument as what you would expect. Now, his argument that Socrates is often seen at the temples and revered the oracle, I have no doubt about that. I don't have any dispute about that. What Socrates particularly believed and all that, it's hard for us to know because we're separated by so much time and there's not enough documentation. But it could very well be the case that Socrates did all the things that Xenophon says, but also that he did the things which people would accuse being impious, which led to his eventual downfall. Additionally, Socrates reports he's got this inner voice, which he believes is a divine voice that tells him to do certain things. To the average Athenian, that might sound heretical. That might sound like he is creating a new god that specifically guides him. So all these things that we've discussed so far, we've still not hit the crux of the argument, and we've still not been able to put down these arguments against Socrates. Which moves us to Plato's version of the Apology. Have another humorous comic here. But in Plato's version, Socrates is seen, honestly, to present quite an unlikable character. He talks down to the audience, he talks down to the charges, he seems like he isn't really taking the whole process seriously. And let me say this, if it is the case, as Xenophon reports, that Socrates was hoping just to use this as a way to end his own life, then a lot of this makes sense. But it could also be the case that that wasn't necessarily what Socrates was hoping for. We can never really know. What someone tells other people and what they hope for can be different things. But, Socrates in the Apology does not come off as being very likable. So Socrates tells a story about how the oracle says that, the wisest man in Athens is Socrates. So Socrates sets out to prove that wrong. And he discovers that all these wise people, these powerful people, weren't really wise. They didn't really know anything. They just claimed they knew things. And that Socrates actually was wise because he knew that he did not know things and he didn't claim to know anything he didn't know. So here you have Socrates going around to all these powerful people, in many cases making them look like fools in public, making them look like idiots. That's going to breed a lot of ill will, and that's going to, cause a lot of trouble. And Socrates does admit that a lot of these young men follow him around because they get a kick out of that. But, that doesn't necessarily translate to being a good thing. That in some ways can be seen like intellectual bullying. So here you've got Socrates and his gang of young men that are going around talking down to people, making them look like dummies, and that can rub people the wrong way. So when he's confronted with this charge of corrupting the youth, he basically deflects. Socrates basically doesn't even argue against it, and just argues that Meletus and Anytus, the guys presenting the charges, don't actually care about the youth. And he says that even if he corrupts them, it's just an accident. He's not doing it on purpose. That's not a strong defense against the charge of corrupting the youth. Because basically, when we think about corrupting the youth in a direct democracy such as Athens, that is pushing people away from being good citizens and being able to practice public life effectively. And what they're basically saying is that Socrates is pushing people away from public life. He's turning them into little hooligans, and further to that, Socrates basically concedes that he might be doing it, but it's just an accident. In this section, I wanted to analyze this in the form of some different quotes because we've already kind of talked about the trials so far. One quote that I like is when he's talking about being put to death, he says, well, for all we know, death may be the greatest blessing of all. And to me, that seems like he could be trying to reverse psychology on the audience. Perhaps he is saying that, death could be a good thing. Everyone's afraid of it, but it could actually be good. So if you put me to death, you could be doing something good to me, which in some circumstances, I could see that, working as an argument. During the course of these arguments, when asked what he thinks his punishment should be, Socrates says that he should get free meals. Socrates says that he should have to only pay a small fine. And obviously, these things aren't really loved by the jury. And we see that Socrates does indeed get the death penalty. With his talk of corrupting the youth, he says, I go around doing nothing but persuading both young and old among you not to care for your body or your wealth in preference to or as strongly as for the best possible state of your souls. So again, this is going to be pretty shocking to many Athenians because, again, they have this idea of bodily perfection. They have this idea that the wealthy people are the more good and virtuous. And if Socrates is saying, hey, none of that stuff matters, well, that can be quite shocking. He says he doesn't really teach people. Anything they learn is accidental, which, again, seems to go against the presentation by Aristophanes, which, again, written 20 years before the trial. So I don't think that this is really a strong argument, and I don't think the audience probably bought it either. I'm not saying that he had an official school by the name of the Thinkery, but it is probably the case that there were a lot of people hanging around his house wanting to learn stuff from him. One thing that was commonly expected at these trials was for people to beg for mercy. Socrates says that that's weak and disgraceful and says he's only going to stop doing philosophy if he's put to death. Now, at the beginning, I talked about how we can perceive things differently when we're younger than when we're older. Socrates, at this age, at 70, he has a 19-year-old son and two younger sons. And I want you to keep in mind with this, his wife was much younger. In Athenian society, it wasn't seen as such a bad thing for a younger woman to marry an older man. This is a society with no social safety net, nothing like that. So marrying an older man was seen as a good thing because he could provide, he could take care of you. Because if your husband couldn't do those things, you'd starve, right? But as a young person, when I see these parts where he's saying, the only way I'll stop doing philosophy is if you put me to death, like I thought, man, that's so badass. That's so cool. But as an older person, I think like, that seems kind of selfish. He's got a family that depends on him and cares about him. And he's basically putting his philosophy over top of them, which I will say is a lot less cool, is a lot less heroic. And I guess that is one of the differences between Socrates and the average person. The average person, if facing death for philosophy, is probably going to stop doing philosophy. Socrates says, well, you're just going to have to kill me. That is a complete inversion of what many people would think to be a normal action. With Socrates, that's part of the reason why his fame and status was secured. I can't imagine he was the only philosopher to ever be faced with death, but he's probably the first one who, when faced with it, said, well, you're just going to have to kill me because I'm not going to stop philosophizing. And that's a pretty serious charge. Now, after Socrates is convicted, given the death penalty, we get a few really good quotes, and I really like these. The first is one of his most famous: "The unexamined life is not worth living." He's basically saying that if you do not spend time studying and learning, then you are not living a good life, and your life is not worth living. And I do think there's some value to that. Next, he says it's not difficult to avoid death. It is much more difficult to avoid wickedness for it runs faster than death. I do think there's some truth to this. If you are a person of average luck, you've avoided any major diseases, you've stayed out of any crime or any issues of that, it's probably not going to be too hard for you to live to old age. But it is a lot harder for you to avoid doing something wicked, right? And this kind of leads to those early Christian ideas of original sin, right? We're born wicked, and get throughout the course of our life we will be wicked. Socrates is saying the same thing. It is very easy to fall into wickedness, and we have to keep that in mind as we live our lives. And then finally, this is in the last couple lines, he says, "I go to die, you go to live. Which of us goes to the better lot is known to no one except the God." I don't really have a lot of strong philosophical musing about this, just to say that it does sound pretty badass. He's basically saying that, death might be a good thing, and he's, ready to go see it, which at the age of 70, perhaps he was. I should also mention that, the penalty he was given was to have to drink a hemlock poison, and we see that in a couple of the later dialogues. He actually does drink the poison and eventually fades out of life, which kind of takes us to the final note, which is Socrates and the social contract. So in the Crito, Socrates is given the chance to escape, and he argues against it. He says that he has been a citizen of Athens his whole life. He reaped benefits from his life, and he reaped a lot of good things from his life. So therefore, it would be unethical for him to try and escape. He argues that he, as a citizen, has a duty to the state, and part of that duty is to follow its laws. The members of the society have put him to death, so he has to abide by it. This is the first real time we see this idea of social contract, this idea that if you benefit from a state, then you should obey it. And it is a significant development in the history of political philosophy. It sets the stage for Thomas Hobbes. It sets the stage for Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It sets the stage for, many modern philosophers today who work and think in social contract theory. So it's definitely very interesting to see the genesis of it here. So that's all I've got. I really appreciate you sticking around to the end. If you're one of the students in my class, let me know what you think in the discussion or during our weekly meeting. If you are a person who found this on YouTube at random, leave a like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Let me know what you think down in the comments. I'll be very interested to hear your thoughts on Socrates. And what do you think? Is it worth it to die for philosophy? Or is it the case that Socrates might have been putting the study of philosophy above more important things such as family? Thank you so much for your time. You have a wonderful day.